Thank you for joining us again for session two. Sue and I will be going through some of the key areas for focus for building out the data privacy audit program. As we go through this, there's actually 15 different key areas. And in the interest of time, we're going to focus on some of the more important ones, but that's not to say the rest of them are not important. So I would encourage you to go through them all. Some of the ones we want to focus on is number 5, which is the data privacy impact assessment. And the DPIA is kind of analogous with our risk assessment. It will really help to define the scoping and kind of make sure you cover the key risk areas. And I think given Sue's experience with doing DPIAs, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her. I can also share with you some examples. But this is a key area because if you don't do this properly, then you can either miss out on key risk or your scope will be so large that you'll never finish. The second area I want to highlight is the data breach notification. So this area is kind of black and white because there's certain things like, for example, you have 30 days from breach to report to the consumer. And these are kinds of things that the legal entities will really look for in order to make sure you're in compliance. So it's just not a gray area. It's black and white, and either you have it or you don't have it. So I would suggest you to get this one done and out of the way, and make sure you keep it updated so you don't get into any legal issues. The third one is the third-party risk assessment. I selected this one because of the fact that it's counterintuitive. A lot of the times when we utilize SaaS providers or third-party vendors, we don't necessarily look at data privacy as being, the reason we selected them. We select them because they impact our business operations, but they are carrying inherent risk to the data that is processed on our behalf. And we need to be, as an organization, well versed in how they're handling that data and how they're keeping that data secure. So this is something that auditors and compliance people will probably think about it, but people that are in marketing or running business operations, that's probably not on top of their mind. So it's important to understand that you're not transferring your risk just by going to a third party. You're really transferring the data, but you still retain the risk. So it's important to make that distinction and being able to cover off on that risk. Some of the things that's quickly I'll highlight here is the data minimization. That's basically a way of reducing your data footprint in order to mitigate your risk. So I think that's another key thing that can be done and should be considered. And then being able to kind of go through each of these steps, making sure that you have them all in, you have all your ducks in the row as you go about creating the data privacy program. So I would go through them one by one, focusing on those 3 key areas that are highlighted, and that really help you to get started. Another thing that we have done to go one step further is look at the legislation itself. So that would be, for example, GDPR, CCPA. And then we have mapped out the sections as it relates to, for example, conditions for consent, personal data collected from the data subject or consumer, and how that is translated to the legislative body and then the subsections. And then if you go to one step further, we've actually mapped out the control objectives that tie back to the subsections, then that tie back to those risk areas. For example, collections and consent as highlighted in our deck. So we've done that as a way of helping auditors to create audit objectives that can then be executed to help meet the requirements, for example, for CCPA or GDPR. If you are interested in that, then we can help you obviously create a robust audit program in line with those requirements as well. Another key thing to note is that the privacy program, the NIST cybersecurity privacy program, I think will also meet the similar requirements. The mapping to the legislative requirements may not be there as robustly, but it is going to meet most of those requirements as well. So that's another area to start. Kind of to move on to some of the logistical areas of doing the audit itself, and I alluded to this earlier in the previous section, auditors really have an opportunity to create value here. Richard Chambers, who's the head of the IAA, he often says that internal audit should be a partner to the organization and not be perceived as an adversary. And so, along with providing meaningful audit findings, we can provide recommendations, we can provide safeguards, we can provide enhancements, opportunities to fill gaps that may not directly be related to the legal framework, but will help to meet that objective. For example, we talk about the data classification being key, and we talk about having a data classification program. That is not a requirement by the legal standards, but that is definitely a requirement in order for you to gain compliance with CCPA. So again, great opportunity for us to make meaningful recommendations in order to meet our end goal for the objectives of the organization and kind of go beyond just looking at fines and regulations, but providing value. Another thing to include in findings is we oftentimes include a root cause. And in this particular case, I think root cause could also include the legal requirements, that go along with the findings. That sometimes helps to push the findings up and help with the resolution as well. So I think that would be, one of the key takeaways is to make your findings actionable, give it more teeth by citing the laws and regulations. We've done that in the previous slides. We've tried to map the audit objectives to the legal framework and the subsections. You can even cite those. And then again, adding more value by providing meaningful recommendations beyond just the regulatory fines. So kind of looking ahead into how to gain compliance and do the audit process. So as you go through these phases of task, plan, implement, obtain, and demonstrate, one of the things to take away is that this is not a set and forget or a one-time process. Oftentimes what we find is that an organization that is relatively new at data privacy audits, they might do this twice a year, 3 times a year, because of the fact that they aren't really having that framework in place. There might be a lot of gaps. There might be a lot of education that needs to happen, so on and so forth. So you really want to make sure that it's a robust process that gets incrementally improved over time, and you're doing it at least twice a year, maybe 3 times a year if you're new to this. If it's a mature program, we suggest doing it once a year, at least, because of the fact that laws and regulations change, technology changes. For example, in the November ballot, you're going to see there's actually an extension to CCPA, so that might impact the legal framework. And then the technologies themselves are changing in terms of AI, robotic process automation, etc. And so you're going to find more different ways to meet those legal requirements. So you have to make sure you update your audit procedures and test plans accordingly. Next, Sue will talk a little bit about the 2 ways of approaching these types of audits.
Okay, thank you, Raj. As previously discussed, there are 2 types of audits that can be formed. So I'll discuss the distinctions between the 2. The full audit is like your entity-level controls audit. This is usually performed after a privacy assessment. This helps ensure that the company has been monitoring and working towards remedying the gaps identified in that initial assessment. Like Rajan mentioned, you don't want assessment to be performed and then forgotten. The privacy landscape should be monitored because it will be important to understand how the company is keeping track of organizational and technological changes and how they're progressing on remediation efforts from the initial assessment. The micro audit is more like your focused operational audit. And you should only perform micro audits when you confirm that a process is actually in place. There's no actual value in testing an area that is not ready to be tested. And as we mentioned before, documentation does not always equal what is actually happening. So it's important to validate the operational effectiveness of key areas of focus. In the next slide, we'll discuss some of the key areas of focus that you might want to consider for a micro audit. So the reason why we recommend these 6 areas of focus are either due to how they interact directly with consumers, or there is a specific requirement from both regulations. Data subject rights, DSR, or consumer rights, or individual rights, whichever you want to call it, directly interact with consumers, and it is a requirement for both CCPA and GDPR. Please note, if your company does not have a strong DSR program, this is where complaints from consumers may escalate to complaints to regulators. 2, the PIA and DPIA, without an effective way for a company to identify changes to the company and how it impacts privacy, information in the privacy program is outdated. Like we mentioned, technology is changing rapidly. In addition, DPIA and PIA also help identify key areas of high risk to the organization to actually drive remediation. 3, retention. Both regulations specifically states out minimum use of data. What we have seen is often data is kept longer than necessary, sometimes even indefinitely. And this exposes companies to more risk, as having too much outdated, non-valuable information that could be exposed to incidents. So it also costs a lot to store, and in addition, make DSR requests more tedious than necessary. 4, this is both a direct interactions with consumers and a requirement for both regulations. And we have seen that this is the main driver of the increased DSR complaints. So you want to make sure that your consent process is actually very strong. 5 is the breach response. This is a requirement. And it's also important to understand how the company identifies an action incident. Without a good incident response plan, this may expose the company to a breach, which can drive significant fines. And 6, as we mentioned previously and emphasized, third parties is one of the key areas of both regulations. They're both resulting from a third party selling or sharing of data. And like I mentioned before, recent updates in regards to SCREN 2, which invalidates Privacy Shield, makes it very important to make sure you do your due diligence on third parties. In addition, what we notice is not a lot of times when there is a third-party risk assessment is mostly concerned with security and not privacy related. In addition, there are vendors that you might not engage with new technology. Sometimes I've seen departments send CSV files of personal data to third parties, so they might not even get involved and might actually have procurement involved. So in these type of scenarios, your company will actually be held to the maximum fine if you share data with a third party, and there could be a potential breach. So in the next slide, I'll talk to you about an actual scenario that we have had in regards to a micro audit. So we've actually worked with a Fortune 500 company in the food industry who had policies and procedures in place. From the outside, they looked like they had everything right. But they actually got contacted by regulators because they received a consumer complaint from the EU. And like I mentioned, they had a privacy notice that are aligned to GDPR, but the regulators actually stated that their website was too complex. So they contacted Focal Point to review all their websites. And what we actually had identified was that the company actually had too many ways for consumers to contact them in various pages of their websites. So it was unclear where consumers can actually go for specific questions. In addition, we found email address or phone numbers that were not even functional. So based on observation, the company updated their website with one consolidated form to contact the company, and they did not get fined from regulators. It is important to test key areas of focus to make sure operations are effective, even if it appears everything looks fine on paper. In the next slide, Raj will speak about internal audit rules.
Thank you, Sue. So I think just kind of extending internal audit's role in terms of being able to look at, for example, the micro audits and focus areas. I've highlighted in this section what audit's role should be and how they can actually provide that advisory type of role. So a couple of things to consider. First is that the oversight of programs, that ensure accurate information mapping of personal data throughout the organization. So this is something that kind of alludes back to our data classification, but it also talks about the work that internal auditors do already as part of, for example, SOX or GITCs, where they have to be able to map that data to specific applications. And by doing so, internal auditors, specifically IT auditors, can help data privacy compliance by identifying new applications that may come into purview for data privacy. A lot of the financial SOX applications probably will be there, but there might be others that are not financial applications. So given the fact that IT audit's already doing that kind of information mapping, I think will help in the data privacy compliance. Some of the other areas of focus, kind of looking to fill gaps and assessments. Again, great opportunity for internal audit to partner on that front. And then looking at the third-party risk, we talked about that, and noting that the information that's transferred out, you're not transferring out the risk, you're just transferring out the data. So you want to make sure that you're really looking at, for example, SOC 1 or SOC 2 reports. IT auditors often review those, and if they have applications that are going to be used for data privacy compliance, then the data privacy officer might be interested in those SOC reports, and IT audit can really provide value by reviewing a lot of those as part of their GITC or SOX testing. The next element is the testing of the privacy controls. So privacy controls themselves, there are some distinct controls for sure, but there are other areas within the NIST framework. For example, there's a specific section in identity management, authentication, and access control, which is PR.AC-P. And that talks about identities and credentials are issued, managed, verified, revoked, and audited for authorized individual processes and devices. And within that section, it also talks about remote access management, physical access, access permission. These are areas that IT auditors typically look at either part of their internal audit or their SOX compliance or other regulatory frameworks. So again, great opportunity for internal auditors to provide value there. We took this approach at one of our banks, and initially we tested it individually. We tested the privacy, information security controls independent from the GITCs and SOX. And what we found is that when we tested it together the following year, there was almost a 40% reduction in the number of controls, because approximately 40% of the controls overlap between IT audit and information security, data privacy compliance. So again, great opportunity to add value for internal auditors and also save the company a lot of money, which becomes more significant now because of COVID. So definitely, I think this is an approach that can be applied to outside banking, but banking is actually one of the most regulated industries. So I think if we can do it there, then we can do it in pretty much any industry. And kind of close out the topic for today, I want to talk about the executive level reporting. Obviously, a lot of executives have cybersecurity and data privacy on their mind because of the news media and because of the legislation. But I think alongside that, we want to make sure that we are adding more value than just the regulatory compliance piece. So I think being able to emphasize the business impact of the work we're doing goes a long way. For example, Apple has recently launched a big campaign where data privacy is being used as a key tool to retain customers. And we're going to see that going forward more and more. So really, what our value add as internal auditors, our messaging to the board should be that the cost of regulatory compliance is going up, and yes, the fines are going up. In addition to that, we want to maintain data privacy and fix gaps ahead of regulatory fines in order to retain our customers, improve our business operations, and generally become a more robust operation for the sake of growing the business. I think that really should be the focus area, and kind of going beyond just the legal framework. In the next section, I think Sue's going to talk a little bit more about her application to the real world, and then we'll go ahead and close it out for the day.
Hi, thank you. So you might ask yourself, if you're a service provider or if you have a relationship with a service provider, why is an audit program needed if they don't directly access personal data? Like I mentioned, companies are being held accountable for breaches identified with third parties where they share data. So more companies are doing their due diligence on the third parties they engage. In addition, as companies are held more accountable by consumers, they want to engage with third parties that support them regarding DSR requests, having security safeguards in place such as encryption and data retention, and platforms that actually consider privacy. Many of the companies I work with are making sure that the third parties they engage with have a privacy program. And I've seen that my clients have actually terminated relationships due to lack of non-cooperation or a cooperation with the privacy program. So next slide, I will also talk about another scenario related to privacy program. So you might be asking, what if there is already another framework like HIPAA program in place? HIPAA has many similarities with the privacy consideration. However, it will still be important to make sure that a company in healthcare or any other organization have a privacy program. For example, due to the healthcare industry, is actually undergoing a significant amount of changes in regards to technology. So more scrutiny actually needs to be paid attention. In addition, often when HIPAA assessments, most companies only perform assessments once per year, and also does not go into the level of scrutiny as an actual audit. We often see that HIPAA assessments sometimes review only policies and procedures or only select a few samples per year. With limited testing performed, it might not capture all systems, third parties, or activities. In addition, this is only a subset of personal data. HIPAA is patient health information, so it's only a subset, whereas the privacy regulation is all personal data, whether it's employee, business partners, or vendors, and stuff like that. So you have to make that consideration. And like we mentioned previously, documentation does not actually reflect actual operation, so a deeper scrutiny actually needs to be considered. In the next slide, I'll kind of recap what we spoke about today. So in summary, it is very important to maintain continuous monitoring of the privacy program. Technology changes rapidly, and it's important to validate the privacy program. In addition, internal audit can provide significant value in regards to reporting to executive management. And so you should consider yourself partners with the privacy team. To help your teams gain more knowledge, it'll be important to be a member of the IAPP, maybe get a certification, also refer to regulatory resources. We hope this information was very helpful. Next slide, here's our contact information. So if you have any questions about the privacy framework or anything in regards to how to implement a privacy program, you can contact us here. Thank you.